Point Blank is a crime fiction podcast. It may not be suitable for all listeners. We discuss violence in all its forms. The works we reference may include period slang, which some listeners may find offensive. The hosts also have a tendency to swear.
Episode 62, Cop Hater by Ed McBain. Welcome back, Point Blank listeners. My name is Kurt. Joining me once again, here's Justin. Hi, Justin.
Hey, Kurt. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm pretty good. You remember last episode when I said, ask me again in a few weeks how things are going with school?
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
They're still going, huh?
They are, but I'm excited to take a little break from that today and talk about some crime fiction because that's a nice escape from the realities of everyday life in school. So, yeah, what are you up to? And are you excited to talk about Cop Hater?
Oh, crap. Let's see. What am I up to? 2/3 into the semester, like you, though from a different point of view. I'm pretty tired and looking forward to a winter break, but that's still over a month away, so I can't get too excited. But I've enjoyed fall. It's been a rough year, but it's been nice to see the weather break and to do all that stupid fall shit that I like because I'm from the Midwest, like walking around with pumpkins and corn husks and cackling like witches and whatnot.
Yes, precisely
that. I ate about 300 pounds of Skittles in the past month due to stress. That's been fun. I poured Skittles into my gin. I
saw that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's a great drink. I call it a Skittle gin, and I think it's nice because for the Halloween season, the Skittles all melt, and so the gin turns like a unappetizing brown. But then when you get down to the bottom, all the Skittles are pure white, like bones. So, skeletal.
Listeners, I'm not sure if I'd recommend that drink, but I'm skeptical.
The gin still hits the target, so it doesn't affect the quality of that experience.
You're definitely right about it being fall. I'm enjoying that. To quote the very last line of the book we're talking about today, heat wave breaks, happy day. That's how I feel just about every fall. Once the leaves start to change, I'll take this anytime over 90 degree, 100 degree weather. So.
Yes, you would. And while I'm a little bit more of a summer guy, at the same time, I have not been enjoying summer lately. And maybe it's my age, or maybe it's climate change, or maybe it's something else. But I definitely am enjoying 60-degree temperatures. I could live with this for a while.
Well, as we learned in this week's or this episode's book, the heat waves can cause an increase in crime. So, yes. Maybe that's best, bringing the level of crime in the city down. This episode, we're talking about police procedurals, and we're going to do that by sort of focusing on the first book of the 87th Precinct. That's Cop Hater by Ed McBain or Evan Hunter, or, about 10 other names for this particular author. I think we should just go ahead and stick with Ed McBain. But we're going to take a look at this, and it is a genre that, we don't really spend a lot of time with on this show, so that's going to be kind of a new thing for us. And I guess it's worth saying right here at the beginning of the show is that Justin and I are really approaching this as first-time readers of this series and really trying to look at the police procedural from, we've read them before, yes, but we're trying to look at this as a fresh perspective. We're not experts on Ed McBain or the 87th Precinct series. We're not looking at other books. We're just looking at Cop Hater as new readers. So if you're really into this series, I know that there is a podcast out there that is completely dedicated just to the Ed McBain 87th Precinct books.
My approach to police procedurals over the past few years has been, I have avoided them like the plague. They've always been something that not elicits neutrality, but almost a fear and disgust, because I've always thought of them as these hyperclinical, technological, like pro-cop, emotionally dead or empty stories that focus more on the science and not on the human experience. And I know that's sort of a like where would I have gotten that from? They still have to have stories and they still have to be about people. But I've just had this aversion that I consider them the opposite of the in the streets, hardcore, hard-boiled detective, solving crimes by thinking through cases rather than taking samples to the lab, so to speak. I was very reticent when I decided I was going to explore the Ed McBain series, and it turns out that I really like the series, and I think Ed McBain that's not his real name, but Ed McBain, the pseudonym, is a terrific writer. That's my first taste of police procedural, and it was better than I expected.
And I think that's, one thing about this particular subgenre is I think it very much, it changes over time as to sort of like the public's relationship with the police department. And, we grew up, I think anytime pretty much maybe in the late 70s, the 80s, certainly by the 90s, we're getting one type of police procedural, the Law and Order type thing, the CSI kind of thing. And most of our exposure is, I would guess for most people, is on television. There's not a lot of variety in that subgenre because it's popular, it works, people watch it. But to go back to Cop Hater, to this earlier phase of the police procedural, it is different. Like I enjoyed this book a lot. I thought it had a different tone towards both the public that the characters in this book interact with, and just the tone of like how we're presented, the police doing their business is a lot different than, say, something done in the last 10 years or so. But before we get too far along with that, I just did want to kind of say what is at the core. What is a police procedural? And Justin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I could say one thing about it. What happened when the modern police procedural was born? And some would argue that it was born in 1956 with the publication of Cop Hater by Ed McBain, which we're reviewing. I have a piece here, a note written by an author whose name I forgot. Let me find it. This is actually an essay about The Cop and the Machine, Technology and the 87th Precinct novels of Ed McBain. And this was written by Dennis Butts. So anyway, he's talking about this moment in time when we shifted from how policing was done in the olden days, deduction and Sherlock Holmesian types of clue detection and whatnot, and then the modernization with essentially the 1950s with the invention of the two-way transistor radio. I thought that was interesting to think. Without the two-way transistor radio, modern policing can't happen in the way it does. But it wasn't just the transistor radio. It was the development of computer systems for criminal records, massive improvements in forensic laboratories with the use of things like spectrographs and radioisotopes. All of a sudden, policing was becoming scientific in a way that was applied and backed up by laboratory work. And this technology was borrowing from physical and social sciences that simply were not accessible prior to these moments, to these shifts in technological availability. And I found that to be quite interesting and in line with essentially the moment that Ed McBain came onto the scene as the author of these 87th Precinct novels, because even the International Criminal Police Organization, Interpol, was founded with this modern policing in mind in 1956, literally the same year that Ed McBain started. So I would say that modern policing and police procedurals are sort of all coming together at the exact same time. And going forward, I can only assume that, as I see it, police procedurals take what Ed McBain's offered, which is this very forensic and technical approach to policing, while also putting that on top of what I like to think is, the story of people engaging in crime or not, and the complications of race and class that allow us to study sociologically the things that are happening, while also seeing how police apply tools that are modern to try to solve the case, rather than having a guy smoking a pipe who happens to be an autistic genius who can just figure things out. This is different. The best of it probably merges the clinicalness of the lab with the heart and soul of detective fiction. That's what I like to think, and that's, I think, what Ed McBain is doing. Of course, my list of police procedurals that I've read personally is quite short.
Well, that's fair. I mean, I think also my list of police procedurals that I've read is pretty short. I feel pretty overexposed to them in the from the screen. I think there is definitely something to this notion that this is forming, well, particularly after World War II and after the Korean War. And I think that there's probably some interesting arguments to make there, as I'm sure a lot of police who were brought into departments at that time had military experience. I'm sure some of that translates into what we see in police procedurals of that time and after that time, that level of training, the use of technology, like you said, radios and stuff becoming pretty much ubiquitous within modern policing. Let's go back just a moment, and I think there's a really basic definition of this genre that I found that I think seems pretty accurate. This is saying that its defining element is that there is an attempt to accurately depict the profession of law enforcement, and then specifically what you mentioned, the technological and scientific ways of doing that work, whether that be forensic science, the use of autopsies, evidence gathering, including a legal framework where we have legal restrictions and procedure. Now, is that always carried out in what is actually legal? No, it isn't. But at least the attempt of that framework is generally there. So I do think it is also important to acknowledge, I think a lot of people will say that Ed McBain and this is the first police procedural, but I don't think that that's really true, especially since Evan Hunter, Ed McBain, he pretty much based this book series after the TV show Dragnet, which was already on. And we also have some other examples of writers slightly before this period writing about the police departments in, quote, writing as they are, not as how the fictional world might portray them. I do think if we wanted to pick who popularized the police procedural, who brought it more into its modern form, I think we could make the case that Ed McBain is that writer.
Or certainly he was the most successful. In all these situations, we have the cream that rises to the top, but that doesn't imply that there wasn't cream that went missing. Sometimes there are unheralded writers that for some chance or streak of bad luck, they were not able to gain the same achievements at the same time as Ed McBain happened to gain in 1956 with the publication of this. And of course, it wasn't his first novel. He had already been an established writer. As Evan Hunter, that's not even his real name either. His real name is Salvatore Albert Lombino, and he got it legally changed to Evan Hunter in 1952. In terms of pseudonyms, this guy was writing with a variety of names for quite a while, including publishing the Blackboard Jungle, which got turned into a film by starring Sidney Poitier. And he says that Blackboard Jungle inspired him because of its gritty urban realism to reflect about the city in the context of policing, and that along with Dragnet were inspirations. It was his own journey plus Dragnet, and Dragnet's an interesting situation. The amount of precision and like sort of police-centric modern procedural components in that plot, but also the amount of propaganda. That show was essentially co-written by the LAPD to try to improve its image after being pretty much maligned by the public and the press for acts of police brutality and corruption. So some of that film was actually filmed in the LAPD station. They had final writers who can come in and make sure that the script was accurately reflecting LAPD in the best light. It was a bit of a joke for reasons that I find to be fairly offensive, the amount of influence the police had in shaping that narrative. So it made me very hesitant when reading McBain, thinking that he was going to do the same thing. But as we'll talk about, Cop Hater doesn't come across as a book that blindly places police as some kind of upper echelon of heroic purity. There's a lot of complicated and ambiguous characters in this first story, and I assume in the other 475 stories in the series, because there are a lot of them.
Yeah, that's worth mentioning. I'm sure many listeners would be aware of this, but there are 55, that's 55 books in this series, which is pretty staggering, really. It's the first series we've looked at that has got that kind of volume and mass. I know in the introduction to the version of the book that we read, the author mentions that basically after the first one, after he figured out like, okay, how does all these pieces fit together? How does procedure actually work? He was turning out a book a month in this series for a while. That's just astonishing, because not only was he writing this, he was writing about 500 other things. I'm pretty sure that the author, whatever name you want to give him, doesn't even know how many books he had officially published.
At some point, you probably just glaze over.
Collect the next check and turn in the next manuscript, and there you go. Before we get into the heart of Cop Hater, Justin, should we talk just a little bit more about, I guess, I don't want to use the word controversy, but the criticism, I guess, of the police procedural? We've touched on this already, but I think it does speak a little bit to why we haven't really engaged with it that much. As you mentioned, there has historically been a very close relationship, at least in the world of television and film, that to get things like filming rights, to get specialists to come in and help Hollywood, they've had a very close relationship with the police, and that hasn't always provided the critical eye that maybe should be necessary in that type of entertainment. That's one thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think police or policing should ever be considered as some kind of neutral party or tool. Policing is a power dynamic, and historically, policing has been used to maintain power, maintain status quos, and to serve as essentially class warriors for the elite. Of course, police procedurals are going to center the stories, center the heroic narratives on police. These aren't stories where the so-called criminals are the heroes, like Kurt and I tend to seek. I'm thinking of Richard Stark. I'm thinking of a lot of these books where we have these sort of anti-hero characters who are amoral or anti-moral and trying to get away with something, and we find ourselves rooting for them in some way. In this case, we're rooting for the cops. We're getting to know the police. We're coming to understand them as humans, as complicated humans, and their work as complicated and meaningful. In Ed McBain's novels, some of the police are straight up anti-racist or at least non-racist, but then you find some racist cops, and it's like the good apples, bad apples scenario. Of course, many people have argued that good apples, bad apples is not a legitimate way to think about policing, because as a institution, and as one that arguably is maintained by a white supremacist structure in a society like the United States today, you can't have good apples and bad apples, because if you have bad apples, the whole barrel gets rotten, that whole metaphor. So the question is, for Ed McBain and other police procedurals, do they serve as, no matter how liberal or how many good cops are in the stories, do they still serve as a form of police propaganda? And I would have to say ultimately that, well, yeah, they do in many cases, a propaganda that you almost can't see. So that's my perspective, and I'm sure plenty of our readers or listeners would disagree with me.
Well, and that's fine, but I would also bring to the table that it's not just what you would consider maybe a typically left critique of the police is. There's also a more broader critique from within policing, and maybe as a whole is the larger justice system critiquing this genre as well, where there is an unrealistic expectation of process, and especially data collection from shows like CSI. You can't just magically get DNA results in an hour in pretty much any any police department in the world. So that's become a problem even in the courtroom, where jurors had an unrealistic expectation of what the data that's presented to them is.
Yeah.
And there's an issue there as well. And maybe that's because it's like diverging from what, at least on a very basic definition, this genre actually is.
Yeah.
If it becomes a techno thriller you could make the argument that the CSI is more of a techno show than it is a policing show, but also the narrative of the superhero cop and that sort of thing, that gives the public an unrealistic expectation of what happens in the real world. And I think that really the biggest criticism that I have, apart from anything else, is that things are wrapped up neatly in the end. Rarely does that happen in real life. There are always unanswered questions, and there is, a lot of times either a crime is not solved, or it's questionable if the person who was found guilty is actually guilty. There's a lot of ambiguity in our legal and justice system that I don't feel that this genre really adequately captures in my experience.
And I would say that is fair. I would argue that McBain probably could be credited for sharing in his novels a certain ambiguity, that his characters do not always do what's right, and oftentimes it isn't like the city of Isola at the end of any of his novels is suddenly restored to order. There's always disorder. There's always quote unquote chaos, and it's never quite clear whether or not things have wrapped up in a nice tidy way that feels harmonious and etc. So I do think that there is ambiguity in some of his work, which I appreciate, but I certainly wouldn't expect that to carry over to all police procedurals. The thing you mentioned about science and technology, I do think you're right that it's not just whether or not policing is propagandistic or police stories. It's the fact that we come to develop a deep faith in the righteousness or in the ability for technology and science to save us. Of course, this doesn't really play out in the real world when we're dealing with vaccines, because we have people who want to believe and people who don't. But when it comes to policing, I think with so many CSI-centric shows, so many shows showing people in lab coats working together with good cops, with the help of science to always figure out what's right, and it works out. That's nowhere close to reality, and it ignores the fact that the vast majority of police cases go unsolved. I mean, I don't have the stats in front of me, but I've read them before, especially when we're talking about major crimes. Most cases go unsolved. Police very rarely actually solve cases, but you would never note that if you watched a TV show or read a book, because all of the cases ultimately get solved in some way. So that's another distinction between the fictional world of policing and the reality. That chasm is disconcerting when you realize it, and you realize how likely we are to believe certain things that are simply not true. That's propagandistic.
Yeah, and as we said, I think, that becomes a bigger issue through the course or the history of the genre. One thing about Cop Hater, at least in this early 87th Precinct novel, is I think this really carries on the legacy of the hard-boiled genre certainly more than a 90s television show does. Maybe with that, we should really get into Cop Hater and look specifically at this book by Ed McBain. So Justin, do you have a summary of it for us?
So, Cop Hater was published in 1956, and it's the first of the 87th Precinct police procedural novels by Ed McBain, who also publishes as Evan Hunter. Cop Hater was, as Kurt noted earlier, inspired by Dragnet, which was at first a radio show and then became a television drama that aired in 1951 and is widely considered to be the first and most influential, police procedural on television. And it was certainly influential in McBain's writing. McBain's series was right there at the beginning, and it's clear that he observed and appreciated Dragnet while also, bringing in his own long history of writing in the crime fiction genre to invent this world of the 87th Precinct. For all intents and purposes, it's set in New York City, but because McBain wanted to create space for, creative freedom, he changed the name of the city to Isola, Isola, and he says that if you placed Isola and the activities in his books on a map with New York City, they would not quite align. So he does reserve that right to consider this city to be fantastic of his own design. In the characters themselves, the 87th Precinct, they're an ensemble cast of mostly, if not all, male police officers of various ethnicities and classes. But we spend most of the time, especially in this first book, with a guy named Steve Carella. He's a detective. We get some insight into his personal life. We get insight into his relationship with Teddy, who is his girlfriend. She also happens to be mute. She can't communicate with words. And there's very much a deep love between her and Steve. Some might argue that Teddy adores him in a way that isn't fully reciprocated, but whatever. So that's sort of the establishment of our primary character. But this is really an ensemble cast. This isn't the entire 87th Precinct isn't about Steve Carella. It's about the precinct. And each book might feature a different main character, but sometimes that character shifts from one cop to another detective to another cop as they merge toward concluding or solving the case toward the end of the book. The short of this plot, as you could detect by the title perhaps, is that there's a quote-unquote cop hater on the loose, or they think that might be the case. There's a cop killer for sure, that much is known. And the first cop to go down, it happens pretty early in the story. Detective Mike Reardon, who we just barely get to know, is murdered with a .45 caliber handgun. And Steve Carella and his co-workers at the 87th Precinct search for the killer over the course of the first few chapters. That's a challenge, and the more people they talk to in this sweltering hot summer, the more clues they find and the more dead ends they run into, and then the bodies start to pile up. The next victim is David. He's killed just outside his own apartment. David Foster. And Foster was Reardon's partner. So all of a sudden we start to see this connection. Maybe there's a linkage. Maybe it isn't just a random killing of one cop, but there might be a conspiracy afoot. I will say that David Foster is also a black detective, and I mention that because police and policing was generally the purview of white men in the 20th century, in the first half of it especially. So it was cool to see David Foster as a detective in this story. Of course, he gets killed off. He's the second body, and Carella and Detective Hank Bush question Foster's family and potential suspects, but there are no genuine leads there. A week later, Hank Bush is murdered. So something's afoot. And Carella's trying to put it together, and he's struggling with it, but he never really figures it out, at least in this middle part of the book, naturally. One person does think he's figured it out or figures it out enough, and this one person is a local news reporter who goes by the last name of Savage. And in one sort of critical, pivotal scene in the story, him and Carella are having a conversation at a bar, and Carella's really reluctant. He doesn't want to talk to this journalist, but Savage comes off as very open and trustworthy, and he just wants to talk off the record. And Carella talks about his thoughts on the murders and his ideas about how or who might be behind them. Nothing definite by any means. He's just sort of, spitballing a little. He also mentions casually that he has to leave to go on a date with his girlfriend Teddy. The next day, Savage publishes this interview in the paper. He breaks his trust with Carella after a promise not to do so. All of a sudden, there's this mentioning of Teddy in the paper. There's this mentioning that Carella knows who has been doing the killing. What if the killer reads the interview? This sets up the final climatic clash in the story. I'll stop there. We can maybe discuss the end scene a little bit later. I don't want to just spoil the ending right off the bat. I would say that as my first police procedural and my first of the 87th series, this is a fresh and gritty story. McBain delivers a plot-fueled, bare-bones page-turner. This is a short book. It's an easy read. It's a book with terrific dialogue. And if there was one thing I would say, read McBain for dialogue. It feels so natural, and there's so many characters, but I never once blinked at the dialogue as being inauthentic. This is just a satisfying introduction to the series, and I can see why it kicked off 56 or 312 books. I would give it 4.5 hits. We've been a little bit rocky with our comparisons lately, so I'm curious to see how we line up.
Well, Justin, this one we're actually going to be pretty darn close. I'm comfortable with a 4 or 5 as well. I've enjoyed the book. I mean, since we talked about doing this book quite a while ago, I read it around that time. I've listened to it twice as an audiobook, so I've had 3 levels of exposure to this book, and I still enjoyed it on the second time I listened to it, but the third time through it. You're right. The dialogue is great. Like, it's worth reading just for that. And the voice of the narrator that comes through in the book as well. Maybe that's because I was listening to it as an audiobook the last time, but that cliche of noir and detective fiction where the city slept and blah blah blah, we all know kind of what that feels like, but it's really strong in this book. McBain writes that and the dialogue well. I mean, I think plot-wise, it's not the greatest plot in the world, but that's okay. I don't think this is a book you come to for that. You come to it for this snappy dialogue, a kind of cynical sense of humor. You're going to get a couple of fistfights and some gunshots and all of that. And it's very satisfying in that regard. And that's why I think this appeals to me, because it feels so much closer to hard-boiled fiction than it does what a modern police procedural novel feels like. The most recent one I tried reading felt very sterile, very procedural, not just in the subgenre word, but like very formulaic writing that just isn't, to me, entertaining. McBain doesn't do that in this. It's sharp, it's tight and terse like we like our crime fiction. So it's a strong 4.5 for me. I wish I had the time to go through more of the 55 novels on offer in this series. I understand that we spend a lot of time with Steve Carella, but he comes and goes from the story. But that would be interesting to follow that along. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. It's a strong recommend to me, to all of our listeners. If you're not familiar, or if it's been a while since you've read this one, it's worth picking up again.
Totally. And I want to double down on what you said about it being almost like a hard-boiled book. It is very much in that camp. It comes from the school of hard-boiled detective fiction. It's just transplanted into a new chessboard. Policing and professional police departments are at center stage. So I definitely appreciate that, and do agree that modern stories that follow a more formulaic thriller sort of structure don't do it for me nearly in the same way that this one does. So when we talk about this book, though, it's not just Steve Carella. There's a whole host of characters, and in my narrative, all the characters I mention are characters that die, but there are other characters who actually live. There's one important one. Bert Kling is a patrolman who gets shot at the bar. He lives, and he ends up being a key character in the second book of the series called The Mugger, which I've read and is a good book. And it's clear that from that point on that Steve Carella, who's in that book as well, he's not there. He's actually on his honeymoon with Teddy. And Bert Kling becomes the primary protagonist in the second book. But he wasn't that much in this book. There were other characters. Alice Bush, who's the wife of Detective Bush. Lieutenant Burns, who's in charge of the 87th Precinct.
We also get some street life. We get characters like Danny, the police informant.
Yeah.
We've touched on the newspaper reporter who doesn't make it to the end of the novel, but still, that's, I think, what one of the things with the characters that McBain does do well is injecting characters and situations that make the city feel believable, and also basically become a character in its own right.
Oh, that's the other thing. The main character in this book is the city. You're not the first person, I'm not the first person to mention that. A lot of writers who've reflected on the Ed McBain series have made that point. The city of Isola, we haven't read the whole series, but as it's a steady throughout every story in the series. The city brings so much to the shape and style of the narrative, to the way the characters are interacting with each other. What we're seeing is a microcosm of the city at large, and the city is a microcosm or a synoptichy of New York or of the country at large. And it's always shifting from the 1950s, from the sociological and the political issues of the 50s, all the way through to the last books. McBain is taking what he knows of cities and reflecting them back on the city of Isola, and then letting the city sort of speak for itself in the story, almost like he's referred to the city as a woman, the city of Isola. It's actually mentioned by the narration repeatedly in some of his books. So I think that intent on his part is not accidental.
And it's interesting too, to me, granted, we're looking back into time on it, but I would have to imagine that especially the darker versions of Batman have been influenced by this idea of the city that McBain projects in here. The Gotham is very much also that stand-in for most large cities in the United States. That even the moments of when Batman's up on a rooftop narrating about the town could very much almost fit into these novels as well. The grit, the darkness, the alleys, the rain, the characters who are making up the population, and ultimately in this book we don't really have a strong hero character. We have very varying degrees of gray, and that's certainly, as we've talked about before, to me anyway, that's much more reflective of reality than stark black and white narratives.
I would agree. I think in this case the antagonist is clear. It's the so-called cop hater, but the rest of us, it's the city, it's the people in the precinct, and it's the sense that it's whoever's working toward resolving the crime. It takes on some small pie piece of the heroic role. which is different, and which certainly is different from the more individualistic detective stories where the characters center stage and they don't really have friends or conspirators to work with.
So you mentioned earlier in the discussion about this technological question in the series, and I wondered how you felt in the book. Several times we get very technical reports, not very technical, but there's no narration, there's no story around it. We're simply reading the ballistics report or the coroner's report.
Yeah.
And do you feel like that adds to the narrative, or does that take away?
I feel like because it's the first time that it adds. I think if Evan Hunter or Ed McBain is doing that in book 35 and it's stuff that isn't new, then I would be annoyed by it. But I didn't mind it, I think, because he's introducing this stuff to people who have no idea. This is all so fresh and new. And I think to his audience, to somebody in 1957 reading this book, that must be pretty impressive to understand how far, forensic science has gotten in a very short amount of time. And in a sense, they might be first learning it, not from the newspaper or the television, but from Ed McBain's books. I'm imagining that's the case. I don't know it for sure. That's one reason I would say it worked for me in a way that it totally wouldn't work now, because now it's either cliche or a distraction to me.
Well, that's a good point. And to bring this back to a popular narrative, I'm sure if you look at how Law and Order, for example, talks about evidence gathering, especially DNA type evidence in early seasons, it's probably very different than how it's talked about in a current episode. And probably for a lot of people, how they understand how DNA works probably came from televised shows instead of taking a science course necessarily.
Oh yeah, totally.
So that's an interesting point. When we put ourselves in that historic context, it makes a lot of sense. I asked the question because when I first read it, I felt like it took me out of the narration a little bit. But when I did it again, or when I listened to it again, and maybe this is the difference between print media and audiobook, it did serve a purpose in that it stopped from more of the emotional or physical investigation and went to this just very stark scientific clinical mode. And that shift in tone was kind of a reminder of how this investigative work is not, as you pointed out earlier, it's not like the deductive, almost social deduction of Sherlock Holmes. It's a very technical, scientific, and clinical process. So yeah, you being used to at least a limited degree as a narrative tool, I think works. But yeah, like you said, I think if you're still doing the same thing 20 novels in, it's probably a mistake.
Yeah, I mean, I think details are fun, and sometimes lists of details can almost feel like a prose poem. But yeah, clinical how-to manuals or technical writing, that's not a good thing for me personally. Other people might get off on it. To each their own. There are some cool things about this book that place it deeply into this gritty police realm that isn't shiny, that isn't overly noble, that isn't some kind of gentrified version of hyper-militaristic policing, but more like this, the kind of policing you see in gritty 70s shows. It's dirty, it's gringy. Writer Peter Swirsky wrote this essay called A is for American, B is for Bad, C is for City, and it talks about Ed McBain and police procedurals. And he writes that it was the hard-boiled masters who took crime out of the British drawing room, as we know, and dumped it into the middle of the American backstreet. But it was McBain who tossed it in the back of a city cruiser on a jumble of tabloids, junk food litter, crack spoons, economic avarice, me-first mentality, and racial prejudice. It's almost like being placed in this cruiser with a pile of debris after 13-hour stakeouts. Just bad health, too much smoking of cigarettes, drinking coffee with whiskey in it, watching for people in the streets, all the bullshit institutionalized boredom of policing. We don't see tons of it in this book because it's a short book, but I think part of the series is a reflection of the doldrums of policing. It isn't just chasing down bad guys and solving cases. It's having to talk to people, having to get shot at, having to sit around and wait and fill out reports and all that kind of stuff. Because while Dragnet inspired Ed McBain, it was Ed McBain that inspired Hill Street Blues, which captures this in the 1980s, that gritty police procedural before the era of the techno CSI narrative. So I think that is something that's really special about this book and ultimately I think the series.
Yeah, the sensory experience definitely comes through. I mean, like you said, I mean, I feel like you can smell the nicotine on someone's breath. You can imagine the BO in the interrogation room. You get that sense in the book. And I also like how, there's definitely an acknowledgement that it is, as you said, it's not a pure thing. They talk about cops on the take, how some are, some aren't. There's a bluntness to the writing and a bluntness to how McBain is approaching the police department, which makes it feel more believable. It makes it feel more real.
Yeah, it does feel like he's not glorifying the police. He's not offering an obvious spin here. He definitely comes across as somebody who's observing in the way that Hemingway observes in third person sometimes. He's offering the facts. He's explaining people's motives to some extent, but I wouldn't say that it's clear that Ed McBain's all in on one character or really has an agenda or an axe to grind in the story. He's trying to capture the hyper realism of this space, the city life and the policing realm in the 1950s. And because of that, I think he can be widely read and widely appreciated no matter where your politics are or what you feel about policing or the ways that we handle crime in this country. One aspect of this book that he really deals with well is sometimes it comes across as stereotypical in the way it treats race, but I think that that's not accurate as we read through the series, and based on what I've read about other analysis of the series, Evan Hunter is an anti-racist, and a lot of the characters are anti-racist, and they clash strongly with some of the more obvious stereotyped racist police characters or people in the streets. And I like that Evan Hunter is, this is in the 1950s. He's really taking on those race issues and also issues of class, but especially race issues. And I think handling them relatively admirably for a police procedural of the era.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that's kind of something that we tend to miss in a lot of, we could extend this out to all sorts of modern things, whether that be the news or analysis or whatever. But one of the things I've always found refreshing about this era, well, not always, but you occasionally find in this era of writing is that bluntness of this is what it is. It's not shined up for one particular point of view or another. It's just sort of, here it is, get your own takeaway here. And when we get the police procedural that is either too shined up or maybe, I don't want to say there's not that many that are super critical, but when we get those more extreme elements, it's harder to let the reader make their own decision. And I do feel that McBain fairly, succeeds in that. And I think you're right. I think you could read this from a whole variety of different perspectives and points of view on our legal system and justice system and get your own takeaway from at least this book. I can't speak to the rest of the books in the series.
So we've talked about the city. We've talked about Steve Carell a little bit, and we've talked about this being an ensemble cast. Do you feel like there was any character that we haven't mentioned that stood out to you? I mean, there are also some side bit characters. We have this Puerto Rican gang that at first gets possibly fingered for one of the crimes, and we could explore that, but they don't have that much screen time. There's wives and girlfriends, and there's these super racist Detective Haviland who got beat up once, and that turned him into a wicked, bad-mannered racist. Is there anybody that really stands out to you?
Well, no, but I don't think that's a bad answer in this case.
Yeah.
I think we have, I don't want to call them bit characters or typecast characters, but there's not a tremendous amount of character development in this novel.
No.
But I do feel that for the size of the novel, we're thrown a relatively high number of characters. And I feel that we get just enough from almost all of those characters, not only just justify their existence in the novel, but to give us a taste of this city. The only criticism I really have from a character perspective is that I guess I'm comfortable ruining the end of the novel here because it's so old. It's relatively short, and there's 54 other books in this series, should you not want the ending spoiled. But our murderer is not revealed until the final pages of the book, and we have absolutely zero clue prior to that as to who that person would be.
Despite this not being I'm not reading this book for the plot. I was reading it for the experience of being in the city with these characters. But I was still surprised by the end, and I did appreciate how it's always nice to enjoy that surprise and fully buy into it. It was a nice twist, and it does set up a good series. I don't need a lot of plot. I need some, but I don't want every book or every story telegraphed perfectly from beginning to ending. That's going to be a death sentence for any series. So he doesn't do that here.
But I guess why I bring that up is it definitely differentiates itself from a whodunit.
Yes.
It's not, there's no ability for the reader really to solve the crime until the end of the book.
No, there's no telltale clue that if you go back to page 6, you would have noticed. That isn't like that. I agree. It isn't a puzzle so much as an experience, and you're sort of left in the dark, just like the police are, trying to figure out cases that are so complex or so open-ended that's why cases in the real world don't get solved. They're really hard to solve.
So one of the things I'm reminded of here in that case is that I have to thank one of our listeners who was talking about the TV show Bosch on Amazon. I had given it a little bit of a go and didn't care for the first couple episodes. I gave it a little more time after that recommendation and watched the whole thing. It's very much a police procedural in sort of this, borrows a lot from this type of series. But Detective Bosch at his desk has this sign there that says, I believe it says, "Get off your ass and go knock on doors." And in a way, that's kind of how this investigation goes. You just keep asking questions, talking to people, and eventually something's going to break, and that's how you solve the case. The facts don't just arrive at your desk, and that's how you, well, I guess it can happen sometimes, but a lot of times that's not how you're going to actually solve a real crime.
Totally.
So what is the legacy of this novel? I think it's huge. I mean, you could write probably a book on the legacy of this series. I always like to go back to these reviews of when the book originally came out. And in the case of Cop Hater, the New York Times originally called it a tough, sexy novel with inherent honesty and decency. I think that review, that at least that snippet of the review, still holds up. But this is a series, obviously it was very popular. It went on 54 more books in the series, as we mentioned multiple times. It was as you said, it influenced a lot of other works, a lot of other TV shows. There was a brief run at an 87th Precinct show, but that didn't work out. I had heard, I think this was a few years back, they were thinking about adapting it again. As you mentioned, it influenced Hill Street Blues, which is, that show certainly went on to influence a lot of the television we've seen more recently. I thought it was pretty interesting. I saw this fact that the author was unhappy with the amount of loose adaptations of his work, which is kind of a weird criticism considering he admits that he pretty much used Dragnet as the inspiration for his work.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You gotta think of that both ways, buddy.
Yeah. So one of the big things that comes out of McBain's work is that the situations in this series are considered to be very universal, that they apply to many cities, like I said, kind of the stand-in for any big city in sort of an industrialized nation would kind of work here. And because of that, his work has been adapted worldwide, from Kurosawa's 1963 film High and Low. That was based on King's Ransom, and it's set in Yokohama. Without Apparent Motive is a adaptation of 10+1 that takes place in the French Riviera. There's another French film, a couple more French films, as we probably have seen throughout our exploration of noir. Because it's been so easy to adapt to the screen, it really supports that notion that there's a lot of universal themes within this work. And usually it's a good recipe for success. And here we are still talking about this book. There's still, all these books are still available, despite the age of the series and the girth of the series. You could pile up quite a table with McBain work.
Yeah, and I purchased the first few. They're cheap, they're short. They're the kind of books you can knock out in a couple days, and you probably read half the series in a year if you really wanted to. I am curious about how he reflects policing as it changes over time. Obviously, he didn't write all these books in the 1950s. He wrote them over a couple decades. And so just like how we explored how Gravedigger Jones and Coffin Ed evolved in the Chester Himes stories, that idea of like how do they politically involve during a difficult time amongst black people during the civil rights era and then black liberationist late 60s. How did that change the attitudes of the police? I am curious going forward to see how McBain handles that in his own police force and how they evolve through the 60s, through these troubled times of unrest in a turbulent era in American history. I'd like to think that he handles that well, but I guess the time will tell for me. But I do look forward to that because I think this first book has motivated me to continue with the series.
Yeah, so I guess I would ask, I mean, because it's going to be very difficult for us to read all of this series, but if our listeners have especially works that come from, say, the latter half of the series and were written more recently that really illustrate some of the changes in the series, I would love to hear that. You know, if there is a modernization point, if you will, in this series. So, yeah, if you have that information, please share it with us. I'd be curious to hear.
One final note, I wanted to add a quote from McBain when asked about what he thought about in terms of the city of Isola in his series. And in 2000, he wrote, or he said in this interview, "I see the city in the 87th precinct as being metaphor for the entire world." So it's a microcosm of the world. That means in the several dozen some odd books that he's written, he has the world as his playground. And that's so exciting to me, to create a space as big and vibrant as Isola, which is a stand-in for New York, that can capture so much, whatever he wants to talk about, whatever political issues or social issues on a global stage, he can bring into the 87th precinct and see how it plays out with his band of police officers and detectives. So that excites me because I love anything that has sort of an open-ended opportunity, you know, like open-ended games where you can just play wherever you want. I love that in a series. So he definitely didn't limit himself too severely here.
No, I think that's a good place to wrap it up here. Justin, what can we look forward to in the next couple episodes?
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about what we're doing with Point Blank listeners because of Kurt's schooling schedule, because of my schooling schedule, and our other responsibilities. We've been trying to narrow down our episodes to focus on singular books, and we've done that thus far this year. Going forward, we're going to be reviewing, I'll give you the next three. Episode 63, we're calling it Tartan Noir, looking at Scottish noir, but we're going to feature one book in particular, William McIlvaney's first book. What is it called? Laidlaw?
Yes, Laidlaw.
Yes. So I look forward to that. It's a short one. Kurt recommended it. I'm excited about reading that. He's going to share with you a variety of other Tartan Noirs and 5-round bursts that sort of capture that genre. And then after that, we're going to move on to episode 64. We're going to hang out with Margaret Millar and her novel, A Beast in View. Longtime listeners will remember that we talked about her a good bit in our episode on Ross MacDonald because they were married and that she was an established and brilliant writer in her own right. And it's taken us this long to get back to her, but we're excited to read A Beast in View. And then episode 65, we're going to check out Cosby, S.A. Cosby again, and his new novel, Razorblade Tears. We reviewed his first novel just a few months back, and we loved it so much, and Razorblade came out over the summer to great critical acclaim, and we said, why the hell not? I've been waiting to read it so that I can review it, so I might but I want to read it, so let's just get it out there now, so we're going to do that for episode 65. So I hope those books appeal to you listeners. Reach out to us if there's a classic or contemporary work that you feel that we need to review, or an author that you would love us to talk more about that we haven't yet. How do they contact us, Kurt?
Well, the best way to get in touch with us is if you have a specific question, comment, or concern. You can send us an email at pointblanknoir@gmail.com. If you'd like to interact with the broader Point Blank community, we have a Facebook group. It's pretty low traffic. You can find that, type in Point Blank Hardboiled Noir and Detective Fiction into Facebook. There is both a page for the show and then the group. So just make sure you're joining either both or the one that you actually want to interact with. But we do love to hear from you. We also love to get nice reviews on iTunes. We've had a couple recently that are very nice, and we appreciate that greatly. Soon we'll have to get back and acknowledge those reviews, but we appreciate it. We appreciate all the listeners out there, and it helps us to continue to do the show when we're otherwise busy with so many other things.
Totally. It's been a pleasure. It's nice to do this every once in a while, just to get back into a book. I look forward to doing it next time with Tartan Noir, Kurt. So until then, stay safe and don't drown in your homework.
Thank you. Yes, you too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.